Welcome to Ask the FM Doctor, an interactive web series brought to you by the Simplard Foundation and IFMA to help you navigate the complex and ever-changing world of facility management. Whether you're a seasoned professional or a newcomer to the field, you'll find valuable insights and tips to deliver a better experience for your stakeholders while saving money. Join us on the third Tuesday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern U.S. time to learn from our FM docs while connecting with other facility managers from around the world. Register today at simplerfoundation.org/FM-doctor so you don't miss an upcoming session.
All right. So today's teaching moment, Facility Condition Assessment Bootcamp, practical tools to get your portfolio squared away. We're so thankful to have Derek here today. He is an expert in this field. In fact, his dissertation on this topic. And with that said, Derek, the floor is yours. Take it away.
A little bit about myself. I'm actually an operator and also currently work for an AEC firm delivering FCA services. So I kind of carry a unique perspective of being able to look at it from a facility director perspective for 20 plus years. And then also look at it from a AEC service provider's perspective, which is the role that I'm in right now. So when I embarked upon my journey for my doctorate, the one area that I found that was under-researched was facility condition assessments. So I started a journey close to about 6 years ago, where I wanted to really solve some problems associated with the delivery of projects relative to facility condition assessments. And so that's what led me down this path. And today I look forward to sharing a little bit more about what I learned in my journey, both as an operator for the last 20 years, actually selecting FCAs, researching FCAs in academia, and then also practicing FCAs. So today's agenda, what we're going to really focus in on is these 5 core points here. What are facility condition assessments and why are they useful for facility managers or directors of facilities? What are the motivations to conduct an FCA? You can see through my research and a lot of white papers that are out there is that facility condition assessments can be used for a lot of different purposes when managing a facilities portfolio. So we're going to dive into that today. Who performs facility condition assessments? There's a wide assortment of practitioners in architecture, engineering. I've seen construction general contractors actually get into the business of doing facility condition assessments. Asset management firms, specialty dedicated FCA firms. And so there's just such a wide plethora of providers out there. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and, who is best positioned, what are the pros and cons to each one of those vendors. We'll dive into that a little bit. And how are they selected? How is an FCA ultimately procured? How is the work awarded? And how does that relationship start? And then lastly, we're going to connect all of this to organizational alignment, right? So how can facility condition assessments connect to the organizational mission and overall decision making? So that's kind of what's on tap for today. First off, we're going to talk a little bit about what an FCA is. And when we use the term FCA, there's a lot of different words that can be used interchangeably. And what I found in a lot of my digging on this topic is that from a global standpoint, over in Europe, they use a lot of terminology relative to building condition assessment. For some odd reason, we all know that facility and building are pretty much the same, but it's just very unique that from a global standpoint, it's referred to with a different terminology. So when researching and getting a good global perspective on practice of condition assessments in facilities or buildings, it's really important to cast a wide net and look at all these different terms. So condition can also be referenced as performance, evaluation, operability, maintainability. The last two are more operation centric, where we're looking at what from a condition standpoint, is it operable? Can we maintain it? Do we have access to it? And then from an assessment standpoint, what are we measuring? Are we measuring the management of the assessment? How are we evaluating the assessment? What's the approach? What's the methodology in order to actually conduct the assessment itself? And FCA really was born back in the early 1970s, and it was referred to as a facilities audit at that time. Dr. Harvey Kaiser first started to explore this topic. And it was really in response to the baby boom and all the construction that had happened in the late 1950s and 1960s, that all of a sudden in the 70s, we have buildings that are 10, 15 years old, and we have a large stock of these buildings. Well, what are we doing to assess them from a long-term perspective? So that was really the starting off point for the term FCA. So it's a relatively new topic here in North America and in the United States. But like I said, however, in Europe, Europe has had a large amount of buildings, dating back to 1600 and earlier. So there's a lot of historic assessments that are in place over there. So through research, we've kind of developed this scientific definition. So this is a culmination of a global review of literature associated with the topic of FCAs, building condition assessments, that previous screen with all that terminology. And it's the systematic and comprehensive condition evaluation of building systems, components, and assets for financial, risk, and operational purposes in order to optimize organizational performance. And we're going to dive into that financial, operational, and risk components here. So from a comprehensive perspective, a good facility condition assessment is going to make sure that it's thorough and has enough depth in all of these different categories that are listed on the screen here. All of these pieces really do fit together in that puzzle of a building. Every building is unique. Every building is different. Some buildings will not have vertical transportation. They will not have elevators or escalators or moving walks. Some buildings might have some very specific programmatic assets, such as a kitchen. And that's very common in healthcare, in the hospitals, and in K through 12 facilities. But other buildings may not have a full service kitchen, and all of the facility systems from a mechanical perspective, electrical perspective, that tie into that kitchen, right? Stadiums and arenas have large $1 million video boards. That's a programmatic asset as well. And so when we look at that comprehensiveness, it really is customizable and based upon your building. So you really have to write that scope of work. Essentially, when you're going to be doing an FCA, you have to write it. You can't just take any old template that's out there. You really have to look at your building, you have to look at your assets, and you have to make sure that the assets that you have in your building are included. I've seen time and time again multiple FCAs where it's copy and paste from another FCA, and it's just the assets aren't aligned with what's in the building. No one took the time to take a step back and say, yeah, it is a stadium, and we do have video boards, and we have 40,000 seats, and that needs to be included in the assessment. So let's get into how this connects to the organization. Well, first and foremost, when we connect to the C-suite, we really want to connect to the C-suite in terms of telling the financial story associated with how FCAs can benefit the organization. That's the one common language that's universal in the C-suite. They know money, and ultimately they know risk as well. Sometimes maybe not operations, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, but definitely the financial piece and definitely the risk piece are very good conversation starters with the C-suite on why an FCA should be pursued and how it should be incorporated into the overall facility assessment strategy for the organization. So the first bullet here, deferred recapitalization. Please note that I am strategically not using the word deferred maintenance. That is a common mistake in terms of messaging that a lot of folks use. Let's just face it, it's not deferred maintenance. Okay, deferred maintenance is, I didn't change the belt on my air handler, I didn't grease my Zerk fittings, I didn't change the filters in my AHU. That's deferring maintenance, okay? Deferred recapitalization means that our assets are way past the end of life, and we have deferred that recapitalization of those assets. So just using that term alone and changing the conversation from deferred maintenance to deferred recapitalization, I think will prove to be valuable in a lot of the conversations to win some of these battles to fund these capital projects associated with the outcomes of facility condition assessments. Oftentimes, the C-suite will also ask, well, how did you arrive at your capital project request? Can you give me a 5 or 10-year outlook? And so what a good facility condition assessment will do in terms of the findings and outcomes will lay out a 10-year capital forecast to look at a comprehensive look at all those assets and be able to put a roadmap together so that a funding projection can be used not just for 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year, but 5 year, 10 year, and even longer, based upon how long the organization is going to own that particular facility or building. That then could lead to a discussion about supporting a real estate decision, whether or not to buy a new property or sell that property or lease, depending upon the overall condition. And lastly, the facility condition assessment could support a bond or a levy proposal. Think about the K through 12 landscape. This is pretty much needed to get buy-in for referendums on the K through 12 side. So after we've connected with the CFO on the financial piece, we can further our discussion along with looking at how do we connect this to the risk management posture of the organization. First and foremost, we want to look at the train coming down the tracks before we get hit by the train. We all know what the supply chain has done to us. Chillers are 12 months out. Electrical switchgear is 14 months out, right? And so when we get into situations, we don't live in a world anymore where we have parts on the shelf, we have our assets that we're going to replace on the shelf. This has produced a whole new realm of risk management for facility managers. Now we need to be able to see what assets are failing 3 months in advance, 6 months in advance, 12 months in advance, just due to the supply chain issues that we continue to struggle with in this country and globally. And how does that affect the organization? Well, we would like to minimize that system downtime for the business. We want to increase reliability. And then ultimately, it's about safety. We want to make sure that everyone that's in our facilities are safe, whether that's guests and visitors or our own employees. And it's also very, very costly to be reactive with replacing assets. Many of you know this. I've experienced this myself as well. So those unplanned emergency repairs, on average, this is on average now, up to 40% more cost overall when that happens. And so if you want to control a budget, we're trying to connect to the C-suite, we're trying to connect to the CFO here. We're able to save 40% costs on our projects if we're proactive and not reactive. Lastly, the hardest part in connecting to the C-suite, in my opinion, and this is just through experience, and I'm happy to share some stories, and I want to hear some of the stories from the group here, is connecting to that operational piece of how we use facility condition assessments. We talked about the advantages to getting to see assets replaced before the end of their useful life, being proactive instead of being reactive. Oftentimes, this also has a direct correlation to saving energy. When some of our assets, especially from an electrical standpoint and a mechanical standpoint, are starting to fail, a reduction in energy efficiency is realized. And when that happens, now we can start to have the conversation about not only is the asset at the end of its useful life, and we have a risk situation on our hands, but we're also spending more money on our utilities than what we really should, because there's more efficient equipment out there that we can replace it with that are going to save our bottom line. And then you could introduce the concept of renewables, right, at that same time. And ultimately, what the goal here is, we're trying to improve that communication between the maintenance personnel and leadership in the C-suite. And I've found a lot of success in telling the story about knowledge management. And I know that was another topic that we had here with the Simpler series. And that does connect to a facility condition assessment. Real brief story on during my research, I interviewed a director of facilities at a college in the upper Midwest. This particular college had 55 facilities on its campus, and he had assumed the role of director of facilities. And after 3 months on the job, he learned that over 40% of his trade staff was going to be retiring within the next 5 years. And he had, and you guys all know this, that institutional knowledge that exists with that personnel, with those personnel, knowing where all the shutoff valves are, even knowing where the blueprints are to get access to them, knowing all the nooks and crannies and all the problems and all the gremlins that exist with facilities, having all of that walk out of the door in 5 years. How do you replace that? How do you replace that knowledge? And so he actually embarked upon a facility condition assessment done both internally with a lot of his staff taking an active role, but then also externally hired a consultant to come in and help navigate the waters of how to lay out the methodology with the assessment itself, and really guide a lot of his staff along the way. And so what he did very strategically is he extracted all of that institutional knowledge out in the vehicle he did it with was the facility condition assessment. So also, there's a lot of retirements that are out there. People are leaving. Getting that knowledge captured before it walks out the door is pretty important. So what are the motivations to conduct an FCA? Who performs FCAs? How are FCA providers selected? And then how do we use them for decision making? So these were some of the research objectives that I had in my PhD journey. So I'm just going to share a few results here, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Like we had talked about, asset management and knowledge. At least from a global standpoint, I found 94 pieces of literature globally where this was an emphasis within the overall research. And so that led me down the road of establishing kind of a purpose-driven facility condition assessment research objective. You can see some of the other important capital planning, portfolio benchmarking was also important. Surprisingly, risk wasn't that important, which obviously now it's much different with the supply chain issues that we have with not having everything readily available. Next, I performed a national survey, looked at over 4,000 leaders through the IFMA network, also looked at the BOMA network, looked at the APA network, and also ASHRAE and ASHE. So I tried to cast a wide net of facilities. So healthcare, the commercial office, obviously, as well as IFMA. So I had some pretty good participation. And some results that we found here, that FCAs are really being performed in a multidisciplinary fashion. The in-house staff, that was a little surprising to me that there was that much in-house staff that are performing them. But again, doing a little reflection back on that conversation with that individual from that college, that makes a lot of sense to capture that knowledge before it walks out the door. But 10% of architecture firms in my particular study were doing the work. Engineering firms were 21%, and then a specialty consultant or asset management firm was sitting at that 24%. So again, the pie is diverse, right? So there's a lot of players out there that are in this market. How the facility condition assessment was procured. Some interesting findings here. The area in gray, the sole source or negotiated with a single firm. When I dove into some of the feedback from that particular question, what I learned was there's a lot of organizations that have already done an FCA. They did one maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And the reason why they do the sole source is because they basically go to that same organization that did the FCA 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and they refresh the asset inventory and take another run through the building and then just basically refresh the report. So that's what contributes to that sole source / negotiated with a single firm. It's kind of a multi-year partnership that happens, and they really kind of tie into a master planning perspective more than anything, rather than just a one-time only facility condition assessment. Next up was the request for proposal. So a lot of RFPs out there to select vendors. And then surprisingly, only 16% did a request for qualifications to kind of narrow the pool down a little bit with everyone out there that is performing. And the most influential finding that I had in all of my research was that 98% of my survey, the facility managers indicated that the facility condition assessment either greatly impacted or impacted their funding levels, which to me was not surprising from my perspective, but definitely worth it if you haven't done a facility condition assessment. It could provide some value, and the 98% of the survey respondents said that it did. And so to me, that was the most important finding for all of us today. All right, so some key takeaways from a lot of the research and my journey here. I guess number one, there are many players in the FCA market, as we saw. So there's architecture firms, there's engineering firms, and when we say engineering, there could be just a mechanical engineering firm doing them that subcontracts to an architecture firm. There could be an electrical engineering firm that just does the electrical and then subcontracts other systems. And so there's so many people that are doing it now. And so that just introduces a whole different host of questions, which I look forward to talking about here in a little bit. Facility managers can use FCA results for financial risk and operational purposes, and FCAs greatly impact the level of capital funding levels for facility managers. These are just a few of the key references that I used in a lot of my research and a lot of my studies. I'm happy to share any and all of this with anybody that wants to kind of dig a little bit further.
Thank you for joining us for today's session of Ask the FM Doctor. Be sure to mark your calendars now and join our next webinar at 12 p.m. Central Time on the third Tuesday of the month. We look forward to seeing you again.